Well, you can probably tell from this video that I am not in the church auditorium teaching to a live class. For some reason, when I did our last session, it was not recorded, so I'm doing it over here in my office so we can have the recording of the last session. Unfortunately, you do not get to hear the comments of class members, but we're going to go forward with this so you can have the last one. So I want to kind of recap what I did in the last lesson. In the last lesson, I talked about 1 Corinthians 14. The problem in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 is that some people are using their spiritual gifts for their own benefit, and that there's also some chaos going on in the assembly. And some women in the congregation are contributing to this chaos, to this pandemonium in the assembly, and Paul wants them to stop. So now this week we're going to do 1 Timothy chapter 2, but before we do that, I want to just point out once again the problem of taking things at face value. And the problem is not taking things at face value. The problem is when we pick and choose when we're going to do that. So here's an example from 1 Timothy. In chapter 2, verse 9, Paul says, I also want that women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with gold or pearls or expensive clothes. But then in verse 12, he says, I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. And so a lot of folks want to take the second one at face value and just claim, well, it says what it says, but they don't want to do that with the first one. They're not going to enforce the first one. They are going to enforce the second one. And what is the reason for doing this? Well, somebody might say, well, the first one, we look at the context, we look at the culture and decide that's not applicable to us. Well, why do we only do that with one of the texts and not both of the texts? So what I'm suggesting is we should look at the whole Bible in its context and try to understand what is going on. And that's what I am going to do in 1 Timothy chapter 2 today. So quickly, an outline of 1 Timothy. We have the opening salutation in 1 through 2. Then Paul wants Timothy to stay in Ephesus and deal with false teaching. Chapter 1, verses 3 through 20. Paul addresses some problems with men and women in the church. He wants them to pray for the secular leaders so that Christians can live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and dignity. Doing this, he says, is acceptable in God's sight because God wants all to be saved. And this is why God appointed Paul to be an apostle. Paul wants men to pray without disputing in every place, and then he gives some instructions to the women, which we will get to in just a moment. Paul then lays out character traits for elders and deacons, and he says, verses 1 through 7, this is what the elders are to be like. 8 through 13, this is what the deacons are to be like. And then he provides instructions about how they are to behave in the household of God. Then he gives instructions to Timothy, first for him personally, then things that he is to teach. Then he gives some instructions regarding the different groups and some personal instructions for Timothy. And then he gives instructions about false teaching and the love of money. False teaching is a big theme in this letter because it's a big problem for the church in Ephesus. And then there are some final instructions to Timothy in chapter 6, verses 11 through 21. So now we look at chapter 2 in detail. First of all, Paul writes, then I urge you that supplications, prayers, and intercessions, and in thanksgiving should be made for everyone, for kings and all who are in high positions, so that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and dignity. This is right and is acceptable in the sight of our God and Savior, who desires everyone to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. For there is one God, and there's also one mediator between God and humankind, Christ Jesus, himself a human, who gave himself as a ransom for all. This was attested at the right time. For this I was appointed an herald, an apostle. I'm telling the truth, I am not lying, a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. Also, that the women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. Okay, I want to explore a little bit of this context where Paul is writing to, where Timothy is when Paul writes to him. Timothy is in Ephesus. We know this from chapter 1 and verse 3. And if you read Acts chapter 19, you find out about the settling of the church or establishing of the church in Ephesus. Paul goes there, finds that actually there are already some disciples, likely it looks like, because Apollos is the one who has taught them. And so there are some group of disciples that are already there. Paul started off in the synagogue, as he customarily did. That didn't go well, so he ended up in the lecture hall of Tyrannus and was there for 2 years. He performed many miracles there, and while he was preaching, he would go on about how idols were nothing, and people should not be worshiping idols. Well, the silversmiths, who made a lot of money off of the temple of Artemis and the trade there, became very upset with him because that was impacting their trade. And so they basically cause a riot, and Paul's able then to leave town unhurt. So let's talk a minute about the temple of Artemis. This was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Here's an artist's depiction of it. It supposedly was 4 times larger than the Parthenon in Athens. Now, technically, I understand there was a difference between the Greek idea of Artemis, or Greek goddess Artemis, and the Ephesian Artemis, but probably by Paul's day, they have gotten merged together. But one thing we know about her is that she was a midwife, and she helped women in their delivery of children, supposedly. In 356 BC, her temple burned, and people wondered, well, why was Artemis not able to keep this from happening? And the writer Plutarch explains it to us. It was no wonder that the temple of Artemis was burned down, since the goddess was busy bringing Alexander into the world, Alexander the Great. So she wasn't there and her temple burned. There's a 2nd century Christian document, apocryphal document called Acts of Andrew, which tells of a woman going to the Artemis temple when she wants to have her baby. So all of that, I think, helps us understand chapter 2, verse 15, when Paul makes what seems to be a pretty odd statement. He says this: but women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Well, a lot of folks have wondered, how could women be saved from their sin by giving birth to children? But I don't think that's what Paul's getting at all. What he seems to be saying is that they are going to be saved, they're going to live when they have children, because God is going to help them do that. Not Artemis, but God is going to save them through that. So they should be looking to God and not looking to Artemis. We find out something else about the Artemis worship there, a text that helps us. There was a document, it looks like it was written in the middle of the 2nd century, a love story. It's called Ephesica, or Phasica, I'm not sure how you pronounce this, by Xenophon. And Xenophon tells about these 2 lovers and getting separated and going all over the place and finally getting back together. But at the beginning, you hear about the woman in the story and how she dresses up in an attempt to look like Artemis. And here's one of the descriptions. Her hair was blonde, mostly loose, only a little of it braided. Greek term plegma is used here. It's the same term that Paul uses in verse 9 to talk about women not having braided hair. And then also in verse 9, this politelia, expensive clothes, this is used to talk about this woman in Ephesica. It's the same term that Paul uses in verse 9 to talk about women dressing up with expensive clothes. So what it looks like here is you've got some women who are going down to the temple of Artemis, or dressing up the part, trying to look like Artemis. And these women have been bringing this kind of idea of Artemis worship into the church and trying to merge it with Christianity. So there's a real influence on this. And in addition to that, it appears that we have some Gnosticism going on in Ephesus as well. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, Gnosis is how it's spelled. Gnosis just simply means knowledge. And the idea is that you have this unknown God way up high in the spiritual realm, and we have gotten separated from him, and this materialistic God created this world, but material things are bad, the body is bad, our spirits have gotten trapped inside this body, and we need to get out, and we need to make it up to this unknown God again, very much like Eastern religion. And who is it that's going to help you do that? Well, there's this Redeemer figure that helps you to do that. In some Eastern religions, that Redeemer figure is referred to as a bodhisattva. But here, as you mix this with Christianity, Jesus is the Redeemer figure to help people to escape all of this. Well, Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century, is writing against heresies, and specifically he titles one of his documents on the detection and overthrow of that which is falsely called knowledge. Well, if you've read 1 Timothy lately, you might recognize this statement. Chapter 6, Paul says, Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to your care, turn away from godless chatter and the opposing ideas of what is falsely called knowledge. So obviously Irenaeus is referring back to this and seems to believe that you've got some Gnostic elements going on in Ephesus at the time Timothy was there. Tertullian seems to think so too. He's writing late 2nd century, writing against the Valentinians, who are Gnostics. And he's writing against those who he says promote fables and endless genealogies. Well, we hear about that in Timothy as well. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer, or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. So again, there's this Gnostic element in all of there. And one of the things you get in this Gnostic telling of the story, at least in some versions of it, is that women came before men. So there's this text in the Nag Hammadi collection referred to as On the Origin of the World. Listen to what it says. After the day of rest, Sophia sent her daughter Zoe, being called Eve, as an instructor, in order that she might make Adam, who had no soul, arise, so that those whom he should engender might become containers of light. When Eve saw her male counterpart prostrate, she had pity upon him, and she said, Adam, become alive, arise upon the earth. Immediately her word became accomplished fact, for Adam, having arisen, suddenly opened his eyes. When he saw her, he said, you shall be called mother of the living, for it is you who have given me life. So in this telling of the story, Eve is the one that comes first, not Adam. And by this, then, some women can think that women have superiority over men. And so Paul is trying to counter this idea in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Now, who was really at fault in the garden? Was it Adam? Was it Eve? Actually, it was both. And Paul will point to whichever one he wants to point to make his point. He's going to point to Eve here because he's dealing with this Gnostic element. But over in Romans, he points to Adam. Here's in 1 Timothy chapter 2, by the way. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. Again, he's trying to point out Eve. But here in Romans, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people, because all sin. To be sure, sin was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not charged against anyone's account where there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as Adam did, who is a pattern of the one to come. So in Romans, it's Adam's fault. In 1 Timothy, it's Eve's fault. Again, it depends on what Paul is trying to deal with. It's really both of their faults. So we have some Artemis religion, some Gnostic ideas floating around in this church, and it seems like some women have fallen prey to this. In 2 Timothy, we hear about some immorality of some people there and some of the things they're doing. And then we hear Paul say this: they are the kind who worm their way into homes and gain control over gullible women who are loaded down with sins and are swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning, but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. So Paul is concerned about false teaching coming from women in Ephesus, and he doesn't want this teaching to go on there. So again, here's the things that are happening. We have false teaching in Ephesus about Gnosticism, about Artemis religion, about the law, and then in chapter 6 about teaching for gain. And women, not just women, but women are contributing to this. Listen to what he says in chapter 1. Holding on to the faith and a good conscience, which some have rejected, and so have suffered shipwreck with regard to the faith. Among them are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I've handed over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme. So he names a couple of men here. But then in chapter 5, talks about the women. As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list. He's talking about the widows list. For when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies and who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to. So women are contributing to this problem, and Paul does not want them teaching anyone. Doesn't want them spreading their Gnostic fables, and he doesn't want them spreading this Artemis worship and all of these things. There is a totally different story in Jesus, and Artemis and the Gnostics have no part of it. Where is it he does not want them to teach this? Well, some argue in chapter 2 is a text talking about the assembly of the church. Heading on the NIV says that, instructions about worship. But I think there are reasons that we can say it's not just the assembly. Number one, Paul never specifically mentions that he is talking about the assembly in chapter 2. Number two, he wants men to lift up hands in prayer in every place. So he's not limiting it to the assembly for the men. And number three, would you really want these misguided women teaching others outside of the assembly? I think not. Paul's concern about them teaching is they don't need to be doing it at all because they don't know what they're talking about. They have been completely misled. So what they need to do is sit in quietness and listen and learn. And that's what he says in chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. Now, some translations have here silent. She must be silent. The Greek term is hesukia. Hesukia appears not just here the first time, but earlier in the chapter the first time. He says, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. So there's our word, hesukia, quiet lives. I don't think Paul means for people to live silent lives. But if you think about what's the contrast to the quiet lives here, it might mean something like unruly. People are being unruly, and they're maybe being cantankerous and disrespectful to the governing leaders. He doesn't want them to do that. He wants them to live peaceful and quiet lives. So don't cause problems. Lay low. We're not trying to disrupt government. So then, look at chapter 2, verse 12 again. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. Again, quiet is this spirit of not being rebellious or unruly. But he says, I don't want her to teach or to assume authority. Some translations say usurp authority. The interesting thing is this is the only time this word is used in the whole New Testament, authenteo. Never used any place else in the New Testament, but right here in 1 Timothy chapter 2. So scholars have really gone through ancient documents trying to figure out what does this word really mean? That's really what lexicons do when they provide you with the meanings of words. They've just looked at how have these words been used. Well, it wasn't a very common word even in the ancient world, and especially during Paul's time. And sometimes people will reach from, several hundred years before Paul or several hundred years after Paul to come up with the meaning of this word. But scholars have looked at papyrus that has been found that shows writings that are roughly contemporary with Paul to say these are the things that these folks meant when they used this word. And they tend to use this word to refer to ruling or domineering. At least in one case, the word was used for murder, although I don't think that's what's going on in this text. But it looks like these are women who are trying to rule over or dominate men, particularly the men who have the teaching responsibility in this church, and that is the elders. These women are trying to do that. So we have some women who are way off base trying to domineer. Now, you might say, but the Apostle Paul doesn't say some women or these women. He just says women, as if he's talking about all women. But that's not really an uncommon occurrence for people who are writing to someone when their audience knows who he's talking about. He knows who he's talking about. He can use generic terms like this. And I'll give you a few examples. In James chapter 5, verse 1, James says, "Now listen, you rich." Now, if we didn't know better, we would think he is speaking to all rich people. But as you read through chapter 5, you discover he's speaking to rich farmers who are cheating day laborers out of their pay. And these people are living day to day, so they need their pay. Not all rich people do that. But if you only look at verse 1 without considering the context, you're going to think he's talking to all rich people. Another one is in the Gospel of John. John talks about the Jews and says that the Jews were trying to kill Jesus. Well, all of the apostles were Jews. Nicodemus was a Jew. Joseph of Arimathea was a Jew. None of these people were trying to kill Jesus. But John knows that, and his audience knows who he's talking about, the Jewish leadership. And he just uses the term Jews to refer to them. And we even have a case of that here in 1 Timothy in chapter 5. Paul will talk about widows. And he says this, "As for younger widows," these are the ones he would say are under 60 years old. "As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list. For when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to." Now, is that true for every widow who is under the age of 60? Well, by listening to Paul here, you would think that's true, that all young widows go gadding about from house to house. They're idle and they're talking nonsense everywhere they go. But probably all of us know some widow under the age of 60 who does not do these things. And yet, the way Paul states it, it's like all young widows do these things. But in fact, it's just the young widows, and probably not even all of them, in this church who are doing those things. And that is why he doesn't want them put on the widows list. So he can say he doesn't want women teaching, and he knows, and Timothy knows exactly who he is talking about. He has some specific women in mind. They are gullible women, and they have been misled. And what they need to do is learn quiet, sit and listen and learn quietly, because they are way, way off base. Now, I want to close this by saying, as I did in the class, that I understand where people are coming from when they argue the more conservative position, the more traditional position. I've heard some of those arguments through this class. I've made some of those arguments myself in the past. But I've had to wrestle with the Bible speaking in two voices. You have this message that women are to be quiet in worship, in 1 Corinthians 14, but in chapter 11, you have women who are praying and prophesying. They're not to teach in 1 Timothy 2, but we find out that you have a Priscilla who is teaching in Ephesus in the book of Acts. And so you have these different voices. You even have voices of women who are in leadership in the Bible. So you're going to have to find some way to reconcile these two voices. How is it that Paul can say, or the writers of the Bible can say, things that seem to be contradictory? Well, I offered in the first class how or why some of those things happen. But a big reason is because we don't look at the context. When we look at the context of these things, then these things tend to resolve themselves. Now, you may not agree with the position I've presented all through this class. That's fine. But you are going to have to find some way to resolve this conflict, these two voices, so that they don't seem to be in contradiction to one another. And you may not do it the way I've done it, but you're going to have to find some way to do it that not only makes sense to you in your mind, but you can make sense of it to other people. I think specifically of your daughters and your granddaughters. So this concludes the class on this, and I have done as the elders asked me to. Thank you.